As a middle grades librarian and an avid reader of historical fiction, I am very excited to introduce our authors this morning. Katherine Marsh is an award-winning author of novels for middle grades readers, including The Lost Year, a survival story of the Ukrainian famine, a Junior Library Guild selection, Nowhere Boy, a New York Times notable and the Washington Post Best Book, and The Night Tourist, winner of the Edgar Award for Best Juvenile Mystery. Katherine grew up in Yonkers, New York, in the home of her Ukrainian grandmother. A former journalist and managing editor of The New Republic, she now lives in Washington, D.C., with her husband and 2 children. L.M. Elliot was an award-winning Washingtonian magazine senior writer, primarily covering women's issues, before becoming a New York Times bestselling author of historical and biographical fiction. Her docudrama-style Cold War novel, Walls, set in Berlin when the infamous wall goes up, is an NCSS CBC notable, Bank Street College of Education Best Book, and Kirkus 100 Best Young Adult Novel. Her other works include Suspect Red, an exploration of McCarthyism and the winner of the Grateful American Book Prize, Hamilton and Peggy, Under a War-Torn Sky, Louisa June and the Nazis in the Wave, and Bia and the New Deal Horse. She is a lifelong Virginian and history lover. Please join me in welcoming Katherine Marsh and L.M. Elliot.
Thank you. If I speak without a mic, can you hear me in the back? Okay, I think I'm going to do that just to keep one hand free. And I'm going to walk over here as well. Now, is that okay for the camera and your production if I don't use the mic? Or would you prefer me to use the mic? Mic. Okay, I've got to use the mic. I'm going to try to do this. Let's do that. Yeah. Oh, I would love the wireless. Okay. Thank you very much. So I'm Katherine Marsh, and I'm really pleased to be here today. Thank you to the Gaithersburg Book Festival. Can folks see this screen over here? Is this can you see with the reflection? Okay, great. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and my book, The Lost Year. So this is the cover of The Lost Year, and I like to point out that it was designed by a young artist named Maria Skliarova, who is in Ukraine, and is from Kharkiv, if you know where that is in Ukraine, which is one of the areas that has been very affected by the current war. All right, so I grew up in Yonkers, New York, with my Ukrainian grandmother, Natalia, and there she is with me. And when I was about 4.5, 5, I moved into her house with my parents, and I grew up there, and she became a second mother to me. We were very, very close. And I used to spend a lot of time in her room because she had the biggest TV, and she watched the trashiest shows, and she had all the, contraband, chocolate and hard candies I wanted. But she also told really wonderful stories about her life in Ukraine. And just to tell you a little bit about that, she had a very difficult journey to this country. She came in 1928, which was a really tough year to come because in 1924, the U.S. passed an Immigration Act that limited the number of people from Asia, Eastern Europe, and Southern Europe as they were considered less desirable immigrants. So she actually, when she left Ukraine, had to go, and there's a picture of her, all the way first she went to Mexico, and then she went to Cuba, trying to get in, and finally she actually got in through Florida because she had a brother who had come before her. And she ended up in Chicago and then in New York City. So she had a very hard journey, and that's what she looked like when she came to America, and I just love the contrast of those pictures. So when I was little, my grandmother had this photo in her room, and I used to love looking at this. And this is a photo of the 2 sisters she left behind and their children, my mother's first cousins. And I used to look at this photo, and they looked so sad. It was such a haunting photo. And, I wanted to know why. And part of it was that photo was taken in the 1930s. And during that time in Ukraine, there is something going on called, in Ukrainian, the Holodomor, which was a man-made famine, a famine that was orchestrated by Stalin, in which an estimated 4 million Ukrainians, men, women, and children, died. And those estimates, by the way, are still being researched. There are different numbers used, but that is one of the academically accepted ones at the moment. That famine also affected the North Caucasus and Kazakhstan, but it was primarily in Ukraine. And Stalin did this because he was worried about Ukrainian resistance. So there's a lot of historical parallels with what's going on today. But I knew about this famine when I was growing up because my grandmother had a cousin, and there's a picture of her there, who came in 1933, was able to get into the country because her father was here, and she survived this famine. And she used to tell a story about how in winter in her village it was absolutely silent. You couldn't hear any noise, no dogs, no cats, no birds, because people had eaten them all. People ate bark, they ate whatever they could, they boiled grass. And she used to tell us these stories. So I knew about this, but then I found it so interesting that when I told people about it, no one else seemed to know. Like Americans were like, what? I've never heard of this. And there's a reason for that. So that was my grandmother's cousin who came and told us what she had experienced. And by the way, she lived to 106. Wow. All right, so I decided I wanted to write a story about this so Americans would know about the famine. And I sat down to do this in 2019, and then, of course, what happened? The pandemic happened. And I was stuck at home with my husband, my mother, who we moved in, and my two kids who were at that point a teen and a teen and a tween. And this is a slide my son actually made during that time. He has really bad handwriting, but he says, Mommy is mad and sad. His sister's tired and mad. Baba, who's his grandmother, is complainy. Dad is mad, which makes me sad, mad, tired, and complainy. And I think this pretty much sums up how we were all feeling during this time. He was home from school, and suddenly that became part of my book, too. And I realized I wanted to write about the famine, but I also wanted to write about what it was like for kids at this time in the beginning of the pandemic. What did kids do? They played a lot of games. My son really likes Legends of Zelda, so I decided that I would write about a kid just like him who is 13 years old, stuck home from school, bored during the pandemic, and he ends up just playing Zelda all the time. And it's a great game, actually, because it's also about a character that's trying to regain lost memories. And so it sort of fit into this theme of the famine, where a lot of these stories had been buried and suppressed. So anyway, so I started writing it, and basically Matthew is stuck at home, and his great-grandmother, who was born in Ukraine, has moved in with him. And one day he gets in trouble, has to help her clear out her stuff, and he sees this picture, which I decided to use this picture that I'd actually grown up with, of these two girls holding hands. And he shows it to his great-grandmother saying, hey, well, that's you, one of them, right? And she bursts into tears. She gets completely flustered and freaked out. And he realizes that there's a mystery here, that there's something about her life that happened that she doesn't want to talk about. And that is the beginning of The Lost Year. And I use that as a way to tell the story of three cousins, the Lomachenko cousins, who are Nadia, who is his great-grandmother, and Nadia is from a small village in Ukraine, who are the people, and she's from a kulak background, which were the sort of small landowners and were the ones most affected by the famine. Mila, whose father is a communist member of the Ukrainian Communist Party. They live in Kyiv. She has a life of luxury compared to a lot of kids. And Helen, whose story is very much based on my mother, who is the daughter of a Ukrainian and Belarusian immigrant, as was my mother, who grows up in East New York, Brooklyn. So that is the story of The Lost Year, is these three cousins. And Mila is missing, we find out. Something happened to her. She's not in that picture. And that is sort of what my readers have to help figure out along with Matthew. You're sort of going along on a detective story. So how am I doing on time?
You're great.
I'm
Just keep
great.
going.
Okay, I'm going to finish a few things then. So as I was writing this book, I finished it. It went into copy edits, and in February of 2022, Russia did their massive attack of Ukraine, and I still have family there I keep in touch with. But obviously, I started thinking a lot. We were in copy edits, and I was able to sort of acknowledge this phase of history in my author's note. But there are definitely historical parallels that jumped out at me from 2022, 23, and 1932, 33 when this famine happened. So they're basically, let's see. Oh, that may be the end. Okay. Oh, no, there we go. So some of those parallels are obviously the use of food as a political weapon, which we see today. There's also the use of disinformation and propaganda, which, you know, I'm sure Laura and I will talk about this, but we're both journalists and really interested in the way that kids take in media and in media literacy. So this was also an example, a time in which there was a lot of disinformation, especially about the famines. That was something I wanted to dig into. And we see that again today with Russia's use of propaganda. So the third parallel, which was the kind of the one closest to my heart, and I'm going to end with this, is that my grandmother spent 70 years writing letters back and forth to her sisters and their family. She had a brother there, too, who died in the Second World War. But she spent, and I remember how happy she was when those letters used to arrive in the mail. I'd bring them up to her, and she'd be so overjoyed because finally she could, like, hear what was going on in their lives and share what was going on in her lives. And she helped them over the years. And in fact, she used to send them what are called in Ukrainian posilki, which are little packages, and she would sometimes hide money in them or things, and I actually used that in the book. But anyway, I studied Russian in high school and college, at that point, and I studied, I was able to go to the Soviet Union twice through my studies, and I was able to meet my family. So I also established a connection with them. And now, just as my grandma worried for all those years about her family, I certainly worry about mine, including my cousin who lives in Kyiv right now, and his wife who are just expecting a baby, actually. So I'm going to end with that, and I'm sure there'll be lots more for us to talk about. I'm going to pass it to Laura, but thank you so much, and I hope you check out The Lost Year.
That's what I really need. You need to do more slides. Just move through it. You want to? I can't really. Yeah, you check.
I can't remember where
I can't see. I'm going to do. I've got notes so that I keep to time. So I'm going to hand this back to you. I have to tell you, I'm so excited to be on the stage with Kate. This is a beautiful book. If you guys haven't read it yet, you really must. It gives you so much really beautiful humanitarian show rather than tell what life was like in Ukraine at that time and family connections. It's really gorgeous, so I hope you'll read it. Walls. So I'm going to give, thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to work through this quickly. Walls takes place in 1961 Berlin when American soldiers stood toe-to-toe against Soviet Russian troops. The volatile year when Russia and its puppet state, East Germany, would plot to raise a 27-mile barricade, literally overnight, you guys, to cage millions of East Berliners. The idea for walls came from me when the former president criticized NATO, and I started wondering, do people remember why NATO was formed? So I started asking teenagers. You know, the reason for it was Russia's brutal annexation of Eastern Europe after World War II, plus its Cold War aggression against West Berlin and any bordering nations that they felt threatened the Soviet bloc of puppet states. So I did start asking teens what they knew about NATO, and I got a, and then I started asking about, this is an old reporter technique, right? What do you guys know? And then I started asking about the Berlin Wall, and I got a, it came down, right? So, you know, here this was, this proverbial hole in coverage. So, and honestly, what could be a more dramatic show rather than tell story humanizing the dangers and the politics of Cold War and Russia's longstanding antipathy to Western democracies than that cruel war? I tell the story through two teens from opposing sides, like I had done with my McCarthyism book. Drew, an American Army kid whose sergeant dad is stationed with the Berlin Brigade, and his cousin Matthias, an East German raised in anti-American propaganda in the Soviet sector. Their mothers want them to be friends, even though the boys aren't so sure about that, despite the really risky scrutiny that it brings both teens. For Drew, the suspicion that his family might be overly friendly with communists, and therefore his dad a potential security risk, susceptible to KGB overtures, which I will tell you all happened constantly on the American Post. I was flabbergasted when I read about KGB people coming and literally putting notes in American soldiers' mailboxes. For Matthias, increased surveillance from Spitzel, the neighborhood spies working for the Stasi secret police. So I wanted to look at what would it be like for an American military kid stationed in this dangerous place and moment in history where his dad could be mobilized literally at any moment against a nuclear-armed foe a couple blocks down. How would that teenager find the compassion and the open-mindedness to care about a communist kid who calls Americans capitalist pigs and has signed a pledge to pick up a gun and shoot at NATO soldiers, like Drew's dad, if the government told him to? And then what would it be like for Matthias, who's been inculcated in communist dogma, caught up in the ardor and the camaraderie of the FDJ, the Free German Youth, to shake off the lies spun by this big brother police state to trust a Westerner? Those felt really poignant and powerful questions to explore, especially in this time of deep political polarization within our own country and the role of disinformation in that divide. So first, really quick, because I have some students here I can see, and for adults too, a bare bone reminder of how Berlin became the Cold War's epicenter. In World War II, our alliance with Soviet Russia had been a wary but necessary one. But as Russia liberated Eastern European countries from the Nazis, they took them over, right? And dropping what Winston Churchill would call an iron curtain, severing those nations from Western democracy. Some of those countries Russia simply absorbed. I hope you can see that map. Others were turned into a band of satellite Soviet bloc nations. Now, to restore order in Germany and purge it of Nazism, the U.S., England, and France occupied its western half to establish a new democracy. Russia retained the eastern zone. Now, here's the weird thing. Because it had been Hitler's capital, Berlin was also divided into Allied-controlled sectors. But here's a critical geography to remember, if you can see on the map on the right. Berlin was buried 100 miles inside Russia's communist zone. Now, immediately after World War II, Russia barricaded East Germany's border, making a death strip with landmines and dog patrols. Russia, the bear in that cartoon, encircled Berlin as well. Americans could only enter along roads or trains controlled by communist forces. My guy Drew, to go play a game against other American high schools in the free zone of Germany, would have to ride a duty train that was run and controlled by communist forces. In 1961, a mere 11,000 American, British, and French soldiers guarded West Berlin. They were surrounded, though, by 400,000 Russian troops, East Germany's army, paramilitary factory workers, and police. Please never forget the courage of those who stood posts there and the families they brought with them to what JFK aptly described, an island of freedom in a communist sea. It was a real joy for me to actually be able to feature military kids who have stunning resiliency in all the moves they have to make 6 to 9 times between kindergarten and when they graduate high school. They're not written about enough. Within Berlin itself, up until August 61, residents could cross the internal sectors from communist to democratic and back again, which made the city this potential escape hatch. Now, if an East German managed to make it into Berlin after evading secret police, paid informers, and neighbors who feared being arrested themselves if they didn't report someone, he or she might slip into the American sector and beg asylum at a refugee camp called Marienfelde that we ran. If they were caught, however, they were charged with treason. Despite those dire risks, hundreds of East Germans tried each week, which infuriated Russia. So in 1948, determined to starve American troops out of Berlin and the West Berliners into submitting, Soviet Russia blockaded Berlin. For 11 grueling months, our Air Force had to land cargo planes every 3 minutes at our Tempelhof base, round the clock, no matter how perilous the weather, bringing in food, fuel, medicine to West Berlin. Those are hungry children waiting by the runways, and the pilots started seeing those kids out there, so they started throwing treats out the windows and became known as candy bombers. Finally, Russia relented, but this is what caused NATO. It was in reaction to this ruthless takeover attempt that the Western democracies formed NATO. No matter how much Russia then and now claims NATO threatens its sovereignty, NATO was born as a self-protective alliance against Russian attack. 1960 this is East Berlin. Children played in World War II rubble that was left as a reminder of American bombing. And in the shadow of enormous banners like this two-story image of the Russian bear protecting East Germans by pushing away a NATO soldier carrying missiles. Being a good communist made a child a hero. The slogan across that building is Berlin Youth Fight for Peace and the Victory of Socialism. Absolute obedience to the state was required. To attend university, a youth had to give up religion and instead participate in a catechism on Marxism and a Jugendwehr, which was a youth consecration in which they pledged their allegiance to Russia, the best friend of the German people. Teens were expected to report classmates who didn't wave flags enthusiastically enough at parades. If you look at the photograph, there are a couple of girls who don't look all that happy. I hope they didn't get turned in, because if they were, they would have been pulled in front of a peer tribunal to give an official self-criticism, and boy, oh boy, it better be contrite enough. Youth attended paramilitary summer camps and signed a pledge. You can read the whole thing there, but it basically says, because of the threat of war by NATO, it is a moral consequence of my political convictions that I, as a young socialist, defend the sacrificial struggle of the working class. American music was banned. Teens listening to radio broadcasts drifting into the East from the city's American sector, or somehow possessing a barbaric Elvis rock and roll record, or dancing the, quote, bestial, provocative wiggle hip of the twist, could be accused of culture corruption. It actually meant bringing a degenerative virus into the pure-minded socialist society. It was akin to sedition. A kid who was accused of that could be sent to a re-education camp. Music, however, is what connects Drew and Matthias. Despite its dangers, American jazz and rock and roll were powerful draws for Germans trapped in the communist zone. You know, radio waves, you guys, they were radio waves once upon a time. It drifted free on the air. And you could tune your radio into it, almost like imagination, right? And they could hear, artistic freedom and a little bit of youth defiance of authority, which was poison in communists' minds. They would do it, but the risks were enormous. Khrushchev and Kennedy met in June '61 to discuss a possible nuclear arms accord, but it was a disaster. JFK came back and said basically that Khrushchev beat the hell out of him. Excuse me, I'm quoting. Khrushchev also famously bragged that Russia would, quote, destroy the U.S. from within by fueling conspiracy theories that would divide and weaken America. He called Berlin the testicles of the West. When I want the West to scream, I squeeze on Berlin. He also threatened that he had sufficient weapons to destroy all American military bases. He demanded that NATO stop challenging Russia's rights and demand of Berlin. And if not, quote, we must respond. It is up to the U.S. to decide whether there will be peace or war. That was the powder keg that the world was sitting on in the summer of 1961. Their failed summit sparked a closing door panic. East Germans flooded Marienfelde, our refugee camp, 30,000 in July '61 alone. The Communist Party went into disinformation overdrive, claiming anyone who escaped had not defected out of dissatisfaction or longing for intellectual freedom, but because of Menschenhandel, being lured in a Western abduction of workers for a capitalist slave trade. In truth, most were fleeing persecution or malnourishment, akin to what Kate has described in Ukraine, that stemmed from Russia plundering East German crops to send back to Moscow. Do you see the expression of the little girl on the right being handed a banana at Marienfelde? It's the first she's ever seen in her entire life. The Stasi secret police even planted spies in Marienfelde, posing as refugees. That man hiding his face knows that they're Stasi infiltrators looking to gain information to blackmail refugees into becoming moles once they relocated in the West, or to punish their relatives left in Germany, which is exactly what happened to Marlene Schmidt, Miss Universe here. She was an electrical engineer, well employed and favored in East Germany. She even had an apartment with her own bathroom. Until her mother and sister escaped to the West. Then she was threatened with arrest for not having turned them in. She decided at that point to flee herself. She will win the Miss Universe contest representing West Germany, which prompted Russia propaganda to denounce her as being seduced to prostitute herself for a tiara. After months of secretly stockpiling barbed wire, concrete posts, and protective gloves, Operation Rose kicked into gear at midnight on a holiday of children's festivals. Happily distracted by citywide fireworks, Berliners hadn't noticed military trucks gathering on the edge of the city. And as most Berliners slept, 38,000 East German soldiers, transportation and border guards, factory militia, and police were mobilized. They began unfurling 330 tons of wire, shut down all trains, doused streetlights, sealed sewer manholes, as Russian tanks surrounded the city with orders to crush any uprising. By dawn, 27 miles of barbed wire split the city. Berliners awoke to militiamen already digging up cobblestones to plant the pre-made posts to secure the wire. Radio trucks troll broadcasting that the wall was to protect the good German people from the warmongers in the West who scheme against us. Remain calm, rejoice. After years of anti-American propaganda, many believed the wall was for their own protection or simply temporary. They stood and watched. Those who protested were thrown into police vans. Anxious crowds gathered on either side, Westerners shouting at loved ones to jump the fence while they still could. Youth stood down youth. Some grabbed whatever they could and ran before the fencing was entirely sealed. They only had a few hours to do so. Many East Berlin streets had buildings flush to the free zone. Some brave souls actually climbed out the windows, like the grandmother up there on the left. Now look carefully on the right. Do you see that child dropping through the air? That child was dropped 3 stories into a net held below by West German firemen. That's how much his family wanted him to be free. Most families, however, could only pass emergency food and money over the wire, and for many it would be the last time that they ever touched one another. Cinder block was carefully added to the barrier, quickly. From then on, Germans could only wave over the fence to one another, like on the right. If they dared to rush the wall, like 18-year-old Peter Fechter, who was one of the first to die, they would be shot. The wall divided Germans for almost 3 decades, until 1989, when Berliners tore down the fence with hammers and crowbars. Not everyone rejoiced, however. Some Russians mourned control of the dozen countries it had swallowed up at the end of World War II, including Vladimir Putin there. He was a young KGB officer at the time in East Germany. He was hunting down dissidents and trying to turn moles to steal NATO military secrets. And with him passed his prologue, both with his inhumane aggressions and claims that victims of atrocity in Ukraine are actually staging them themselves. And as one dissident described the KGB, if the snow is falling, they will calmly tell you that the sun is shining. That's history in a 12-minute lesson. Thank you. Do you all have questions for us? Or we can ask each other things.
Yeah, go ahead, Fred.
Yeah, Katherine, you said that there's a reason we don't know about the 4 million people dying. I mean, it seems to imply that...
Yeah, there are a couple reasons we don't know. One is the suppression by Stalin and his government, who just basically said there was no famine, that was fake news, and it was happening mostly in Ukraine. So if you were living in a different part of Russia, you might not know that it was going on. In addition, what I found interesting as an American journalist is that one of the most important, and this is something I worked into the book, one of the most important reports that came out on the famine that was contemporaneous was by a reporter named Walter Duranty, who worked for the New York Times, and he was the Russia correspondent. He'd won Pulitzers. He was very, esteemed. But he was also, Stalin would not let foreign journalists leave Moscow. And if you did so without the permission of the authorities. And Walter Duranty wanted to be on the good side of the authorities, and he also got a lot of perks from Stalin. And so he reported what the official line was. And famously, there is a New York Times story that said Ukrainians, or actually it said Russians, because at that point they were talking about Ukraine as well. Russians are hungry, he wrote, but not starving. And it took a bunch of actual citizens, some of them were citizen journalists, some of them were journalists from other countries who either, in some cases, there is one from the Jewish community who had his brothers were actually communist officials, which gave him in Ukraine, which gave him more freedom to travel around. And so he was able to actually witness what was going on and write about it. But that was only in the Yiddish papers. There's a Canadian journalist who went in by herself, just drove down there, and also reported. And then most famously, there is Gareth Jones, who is a Welsh political advisor who spoke Russian and went into Ukraine himself and wrote about what he saw, which was, mass starvation. But those reports didn't carry as much weight as Durante's because of his position. And it's a really wonderful, I think, and vivid example of how disinformation can actually shape history.
I'll ask you a question. Tell me about, I was really fascinated by, and it's difficult, you all, to write multiple POVs and different time frames, but I think it really synthesized themes beautifully for you. Can you talk a little bit about why you chose to do the different time frames and the different POVs?
Sure. So in The Lost Year, we hear from the perspective of Matthew, who's the 13-year-old who is in modern-day New Jersey and going through the early part of the COVID pandemic. We hear from Mila, who is the daughter of the Communist Party official, and we also hear from Helen, who is the American, but from a Ukrainian immigrant background. And I felt it was important to have all those perspectives, and Nadia, the one who actually experiences the famine, her story is told through Mila, and there's a reason for that that I will not give away. I will not divulge. But it is hard to write multiple perspectives, but each of these perspectives all of the characters represented different experiences. Also in my family, my grandmother's background was most like Nadia's. She came from a small village. My mother's background is very much like Helen, and I used a lot of the details, including that, my mother used to take caviar sandwiches to school, and kids would laugh at her. And she, was very embarrassed. And that was something I was able to work into the book because she wanted to be an American. And then I spent some time when I was in the Soviet Union, not to date myself, but at a very famous communist youth camp as an exchange camper from America. We were the American delegation at a place called Artek, which is in Crimea. And so I spent a summer there, and that was really the waning days of the Soviet Union, and I got to see some of the sort of things that, that Mila would have experienced as herself as a young pioneer. And the young pioneers are like the communist Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts. So, all of those perspectives went into the characters and informed the voices of the characters. And that made it, I think, a bit easier for me. But I'm also a mystery writer. And so, I've won the Edgar. That's what I do. I create mysteries. And there's a big surprise in this book. We're not going to talk about it. But what I always challenge young readers is see if you could figure it out before Matthew what really happened to his family, because there's a huge family secret there. So, did you have a question? Okay, that's okay. I'm done. I was going to ask. Okay, please, go ahead.
I'm just so fascinated by this parallel of disinformation in history, especially the purposeful disinformation and this, like, the we will get you from within kind of thing, and what's happening in critical, in particularly social media, in the last 5 years. I work with future teachers, and I try really, really hard to get them aware to think about how they might help their students become more critical readers. But I just thought either one of you might start about purposeful disinformation.
Yeah.
I found that quote particularly
Frightening? Yeah.
particularly since it's like so parallel
Happening now.
right now.
Yes. I have a teacher's packet I want to give you before you leave, which is all about how I've done a lot of their lesson plans and a video I did with, forgive me, I'm going to say Fall for the Book Festival, but it's all about disinformation and how it repeats itself through history and how you can help kids recognize it. Often it's easier for them to recognize in a story like we've done, in a narrative where they can empathize and worry about characters rather than being thrown a blank or, being thrown at, what do you see there? It's like, see it instead through our characters. This has been a theme of 3 books of mine now. The first was with a book on McCarthyism that I wrote that is all about book banning and disinformation and un-American activities and being called disloyal if you are, if you question the status quo, if you were involved with civil rights, you were labeled as a pinko, and you would have been called potentially in front of McCarthy's Senate committee. So Suspect Red is about that. Berlin became very much about, Walls became very much about that as well. That's why I always, in both Suspect Red and in Walls, and something I've just done on Watergate, I have 2 teens on opposite sides of the political spectrum. Disinformation is a terrifyingly potent thing. When I showed you those photographs, I was going through very quickly, but there were hundreds, thousands of East Berliners who went, yes, rejoice. We're going to be safe from the demon Americans with their wiggle hip and their terrible, we laugh about it, but because it's so ridiculous, because how innocent is the twist? But it was so purposeful and done throughout their lifetimes that they really came to believe that we were after them. We were going to do anything we could to undo their new just society. I didn't put the photograph because sometimes I have younger kids in, but there's one of mass toilet training. They began when they were toddlers, making them all go at the same time to learn obedience to the state and to be working as a collective, okay? We have our own issues with disinformation. I go back to the Red Scare and things that are happening now. And it is critically, critically important that our teenagers learn to be able to say, does that make sense? Is that really a degenerative dance that's going to throw me into, it's really, really important. And I think Kate's book really, if you can read our books together, and I do have these lesson plans that I will give you, I think it's a way that's a little less intimidating for teens to be able to think about this.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'll just add that Matthew, my 13-year-old protagonist, is the son of a reporter, and that is something I did intentionally, both being a journalist, and my husband is also a reporter as well. And I did that also because I wanted to talk to kids about how the sausage is made. And I think that's a really important part of media literacy, is to talk about what goes into reliable journalism. And in my book, Matthew ends up writing down the story he learns. He decides he's going to be the oral historian, and oral history is another very big part of this book. And Matthew really struggles, and he struggles as a writer. He struggles to sort of know how to present the material. And that was something I hear often when I go to schools from teachers about kids really sort of, I love talking to kids who actually hate writing. That's something I love doing, because I think it's really important not to judge yourself as a writer because you hate it, because often I hate it. And what goes into it is really caring about it and revision. But to get back to the media literacy piece, this was something I was working at the Washington Post last spring as an editor there. And this is something that I worry about a lot, because when I was visiting kids at schools, I was hearing things like, so where do you guys get your information? Is it social media or is it your local newspaper? And I'd name the local newspaper, and guess what they said? Not just social media, but they'd say, what's that? They'd never heard of the local newspaper. And local newspapers, sadly, are dying, and they will continue to do so because of that. But I think it's really important, and this is something that I do in the book in the context of a story that's hopefully fun and has a mystery, is to talk a little bit about how you gauge the information you get, how a good journalist puts that together. And that's being, for example, having multiple sources. That's a really important thing. And there's a whole bunch of things that I also have. I have a teacher's guide where we talk about some of the things that you should be on the lookout for when you're looking either at social media or just regular media. I think the last thing that's really important is, to be able to be a critical thinker and to be an open and curious thinker. And I actually, I have a Ukrainian grandmother, but I also had a Belarusian grandfather. That side of the family is not Jewish. My father's side of the family is Jewish and came from a very similar area. In fact, my two grandfathers came from different worlds, probably 100 miles apart. And because of that, I don't like to see things necessarily, as us versus them. It's really important. I've spent time in Russia. I've spent time in Ukraine. And I think that we can state things that are morally wrong, but at the same time, we can look at individuals as individuals. And that is a really important thing, I think, for Americans, too, at this moment, where we tend to polarize and we tend to see our enemies as almost inhuman. And I think that is a really important part of The Lost Year as well.
Yeah, it's stereotyping is the issue of having this mindset. And in both these books, Suspect Red and Walls, the teenagers have to overcome what they've been inculcated to believe about the other through personal experience. It's like, oh, he doesn't really talk like that. And at one point I have Matthias, who has a droll sense of humor, which helps me make him endearing to you when he is sometimes spouting political dogma that infuriates the reader, is that he actually at one point looks at Drew and says, I don't see horns and a tail on you. Gee. So, anyway.
Oscar question. I actually worked for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty for quite a few years before moving into the library world. And it's interesting because I think you also have to view it from the people that are coming from the countries or in the countries. Because to them, the news that they're getting, they don't know that it's propaganda from their country. So it's also that sort of the re-educating of, what is right, what is true, what is fact. And, when we have those people working here trying to get that information back into those countries, like all the work that's being done so that we can get the correct information.
I have to say that your kind of work and what like AFN was doing during the 60s was so important. There's this amazing anecdote. I did a lot of reporting for this book in that I was able to find Berlin brats who had been teenagers in 60s, they're in their late 70s now, who told me all these amazing stories, like the fact that there were all these kidnapping attempts of American personnel and their families. But there was also this story that I read that the music would draw a lot of the youth. And there was David Brubeck went and actually did an State Department cultural diplomacy, went to perform, and they recorded and pirated his performance, and they could only do it, though, they found old x-rays of chest x-rays of communist chests and hearts, and American jazz was recorded over top of that. I just love the imagery of that.
Love that detail.
So.
Yeah, that's truly a wonderful detail, and Laura's book has a number of them. So.
Well, it's reporting. I mean, honestly, and my daughter's sitting back here, and she's going to go, she's going to talk about footnotes now. But footnotes, you guys, they're the best. And all those primary documents, I wanted to show you those photographs because I can tell you, yak at you guys. But if you can see that child dropping 3 stories, if you can see that child being, oh my God, it's a banana, that tells you in a visceral way, much more than I like to think I'm a good writer, but, a photograph like that, a primary document, you guys, you love primary documents, right? So they give you that, and that's what newspapers used to do, right? And hopefully still do, yeah.
Any other questions? So, Laura, let me ask you a question.
Oh, dear. Okay.
So I'm curious whether you did you travel there for this book? Did you spend any time there? Were you able to see the places that you were writing about?
No, it's the only time that I haven't gone to the place where I was reporting, and it made me crazy. But I'm old enough now, too, and here's Gussie Lewis, who I have to thank because she was the first person who really promoted me among schools, and I'm so grateful to you, Gussie, always. It was 20 years ago. When I first did Under a War-Torn Sky, which was inspired by my dad's experiences as a B-24 bomber pilot, there weren't all these amazing digital collections. So I did have to go to France. Gosh darn, it was terrible. We went to France and interviewed people and went to not state-run museums, but little local community museums, which is where you get your hands on, the real stuff that family members have. I couldn't do that because COVID happened. but I can now get into that stuff through digital archives. And also, because of having been a reporter, I think, I don't mind admitting that I don't know something and to ask people. And my son had a friend who's actually a native Berliner who had gone home. And I said, can you go to all these museums for me, please, and just surreptitiously photograph everything? And he did. And so that helped me a lot. But normally I would have been trying to go through everything, and I do hope to go someday.
Yeah. Well, I think COVID has made it a lot tougher to do a lot of things, and so I think we're getting close to wrapping up. Does anybody have a final question before we do? Any last questions?
What's next?
Yeah, that's a good question. You want to go first?
I just finished, so my mind is a little blurred. Actually, my editor of Walls asked me to do something about Watergate. So I did, but 1973, you all should know, was an incredibly pivotal year. It wasn't just Watergate, the unraveling of Watergate, but it was the undoing of the ERA by lies and propaganda from certain people and Roe. So it's a lot. That's what I've just finished up.
So this book Lost Year was so personal for me, and it just really, I think, having the war ramp up just as it went into copy edits, it tore my heart apart, frankly. And I wrote this story. I wrote this book for my grandma. I wrote it for her people. And afterwards, I really needed to do something different. And so I write in a lot of different genres. My previous book, Nowhere Boy, is what was a contemporary and is now becoming a historical fiction story that was set in 2015 in Brussels during the refugee crisis there, where I was living at the time. But my next book goes back to fantasy, and I've written a lot of Greek myth and fantasy, and my next is going to be a series called The Myth of Monsters, and the first book is called Medusa, and it's a feminist retelling of the Medusa story.
Ooh.
So that was like a nice, I have to say I needed to do something that was a little bit less heavy for me and less personal. So
You all should just know how much talent it takes to be able to jump around in those kinds of genres.
thank you, everyone, for being here today.
Thank you very much.
I really appreciate it.